I still remember the sound of the clock that morning, soft, steady, and far too loud for a house that's been silent for 10 years. My days begin the same way they always have since Thomas passed. I brew a small pot of tea, open the curtains just wide enough to let in the gold of morning, and sit by the window where the light catches the dust in the air. They sparkle, those tiny specks, like little ghosts of sunlight. I call them my visitors. The kettle whistled faintly as I moved about the kitchen, my slippers sliding against the wooden floor. The house, though small, feels too large for one heart to fill. Every room still breathes him. His pipe still rests on the mantel, his reading glasses on the nightstand, and his Bible, that old brown leather Bible, sits on the third shelf of our bookcase. It has sat there for 10 years, untouched. I dust the shelves every Sunday, but I never touch the Bible itself. Somehow it feels sacred, like a shrine that belongs only to him. But that morning, as I lifted the duster, my hand hesitated. Maybe it was the way the sunlight fell directly across its cover, making the golden letters of Holy Bible gleam faintly. Or maybe it was because my heart, for reasons I can't name, felt an ache stronger than usual. 10 years, and yet it still felt like he'd only just stepped out to the shed and hadn't returned. I set down my tea. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the Bible. The leather was dry, cracked at the edges, and faintly smelled of pine, Thomas's scent, as if the years hadn't stolen it away. When I opened the cover, a small puff of dust lifted into the air. My fingers brushed the edges of the pages. Some were worn thin where his thumbs had lingered. I could almost picture him sitting in his armchair, glasses halfway down his nose, murmuring softly as he read. "Palms always gives you peace," I used to tease him. "Peace," he'd say, smiling, "and reminders of what I need forgiving for." Those words came back to me so clearly that I had to sit down. The house hummed with stillness, the kind that amplifies every tiny sound. The ticking clock, the creak of the chair, the faint whisper of leaves outside. I turned a few pages at random, tracing underlined verses, little notes he had made in the margins. Patience, grace, forgive quickly. That was Thomas, a man of few words, but always gentle ones. And then, my thumb caught on something thicker than a page. It was near the middle of the Bible, tucked between Psalms 51 and 52, the prayer of repentance. I frowned, carefully prying it open. A small yellowed piece of folded paper rested there, pressed flat by time. At first, I thought it might be an old church program or a bookmark, but when I turned it over, my breath caught in my chest. It was his handwriting, Thomas's handwriting. Even after a decade, I would know it anywhere. The strong, careful strokes, the little curve at the end of his T's. My hands went cold. I hesitated before opening it. My heart thumped so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The paper unfolded with a fragile sound, like the sigh of something long forgotten. Inside, written in faded blue ink, were just 2 short lines. "If you ever find this, please forgive me. There's something I never told you." That was all. No signature, no date, just those words, and that familiar handwriting that seemed to breathe his voice back into the room. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was some old church verse, something unrelated. But no, that was his ink, his hand, his soul on that paper. Forgive me. The words echoed through my mind again and again, like a prayer left unfinished. Forgive me for what, Thomas? I read it a second time, slower this time. My eyes filled with tears, blurring the words until the ink seemed to swim. I pressed the paper against my chest, feeling the beat of my heart against it. My husband had never kept secrets from me, or so I'd always believed. He'd been an honest man, a good man, the kind of man's silence always meant peace, not deceit. But this little folded truth in the heart of his Bible, it was something different. The tea on the table had gone cold. I didn't notice. My mind was racing through years of moments, every quiet glance, every late-night prayer. I remembered the times I'd woken up and found him sitting by the window, his face lit by the moonlight, Bible open on his lap. And I remembered asking, "Can't sleep again?" And he'd smile, saying, "Just talking to God." Was this what he'd been talking about? I set the note down on the table and looked around the room. The photographs on the wall, our wedding picture in its wooden frame. His smile looked so real, so near. I whispered to the empty air, "Thomas, what didn't you tell me?" The silence that followed felt alive. A single page in the Bible fluttered, as if moved by breath, though no window was open. The clock struck 8, its chime echoing through the quiet house. I folded the note again, carefully, as though it might break. I slipped it back into the Bible, but only halfway this time. I couldn't bear to close it completely. I stared out the window, the light now brighter, sharper. The world outside looked the same, but something within me had changed. It wasn't grief, not the kind I'd known before. It was something else, a strange, aching curiosity, a need to know. And for the first time in 10 years, I whispered aloud a prayer I hadn't spoken since the day he died. "Lord, if there's something he couldn't tell me, help me find it. I'm ready now." The clock ticked on. The sunlight fell softly across the Bible's open pages. And deep within that quiet morning, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning after I found the note, the world felt different, quieter, though nothing had really changed. The same sunlight filtered through my lace curtains. The same ticking clock watched over the same still house. Yet every sound seemed to echo deeper, as if the walls were listening. The note lay folded neatly in my apron pocket. I couldn't bring myself to leave it in the Bible again. Not yet. It felt as though it might vanish the moment I looked away, like a secret that wanted to stay hidden unless held close. As I poured myself a cup of tea, I caught sight of Thomas's chair across the table. For 10 years it had remained untouched. I'd dusted it, yes, but never moved it, never sat in it. It was his place. The faint indent in the cushion still carried the memory of his weight. Sometimes I'd glance there expecting him to lift his cup and say, "You forgot the sugar again, Evie." I smiled faintly at the thought, but it faded quickly. Now another voice in my mind whispered, "What didn't he tell you, Evelyn?" The words haunted me through the quiet morning. I tried to occupy myself with chores, folding the laundry, feeding the cat, watering the fern by the window. But every small act brought him back to me. I'd pick up a shirt and remember how he rolled his sleeves while working on the porch. I'd open the cupboard and see the jar of honey he always claimed could fix anything, even sadness. Memory, it seems, isn't polite. It barges in, uninvited, and sits beside you until you listen. By afternoon, I found myself in the hallway where our photographs hung. Our wedding picture at the center, surrounded by smaller frames of birthdays, picnics, and Christmas mornings. I stood there longer than usual, studying his face. It was the smile that first caught me. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at me. There was something in his eyes I hadn't noticed before, something that looked like longing and peace intertwined. I ran my finger over the glass and whispered, "What were you hiding behind that smile, Thomas?" My throat tightened. I could almost hear him chuckle, telling me I was overthinking again. But the note had cracked something open inside me. Now every memory carried a shadow I couldn't unsee. That evening, as I prepared supper, I remembered another night, years ago, when I'd woken to find the bed empty beside me. The house had been dark except for a faint light under the door of his study. I'd gone to check, half asleep, and found him at his desk, shoulders hunched, writing something by candlelight. When I asked what he was doing, he had smiled, folded the paper quickly, and said, "Just writing down prayers, love. Go back to sleep." At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. Thomas often prayed before bed. He believed peace was something you had to practice, not expect. But now, remembering that folded paper and the way he'd hidden it so swiftly, I wondered, was that note one of his prayers? And if so, what had he been asking forgiveness for? The sound of gravel outside pulled me back to the present. A car door closed, followed by quick footsteps on the porch. "Grandma?" I smiled despite myself. "Come in, Grace. Door's open." The screen door creaked as my granddaughter stepped in, bringing a breeze of laughter and the scent of the world outside, perfume, coffee, and autumn air. She was 25 now, sharp-minded and always in a hurry, yet she carried the same softness her mother once had. "There you are," she said, placing a brown paper bag on the table. "I brought you pie from Murphy's Cafe, apple, your favorite." "That's very kind," I said, though my voice came out more fragile than I intended. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. She always noticed too much. "You look tired, Grandma. Everything all right?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine, dear. Just doing some cleaning. You know me. Can't stand dust." She sat across from me, watching closely. "You sure? You look like something's on your mind." I hesitated, my hand unconsciously brushing the pocket where the note rested. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to take out that folded piece of paper and say, "Grace, help me understand this." But how could I? How could I explain that her grandfather, the man who had tucked her into bed, carved her wooden toys, and prayed with her at night, might have carried a secret even I never knew? So I just nodded. "Nothing you need to worry about." She didn't believe me. I could see it in the way she tilted her head slightly, that little Miller look of concern. "If you so," she said finally, "but if something's bothering you, you know you can talk to me." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I know, sweetheart. Thank you." Her hand was warm, alive, full of energy. Mine felt paper-thin in comparison. We spent the next hour talking about her work, her apartment, her plans. I smiled where I could, laughed where I should, but half of me was somewhere else. In the past, in the study, where Thomas once sat writing by candlelight. When she finally left, promising to visit again soon, the house fell back into silence. I stood by the window, watching her car disappear down the road, and felt the loneliness return like a tide. The note still pressed against my chest in the apron pocket, its presence burning through the fabric. I walked to the living room and stood in front of Thomas's study door. It was closed, as it had been for years. I hadn't stepped inside since the day after his funeral. My hand hovered over the doorknob. For a moment, I almost turned it. But then I stopped. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I leaned my forehead against the door and whispered, "Why didn't you tell me, Thomas? Whatever it was, you didn't have to carry it alone." Only silence answered. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. The clock ticked steadily, and the moonlight painted the room silver. Every creak of the house sounded like his footsteps. Every sigh of wind felt like his breath. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of our wedding day, the church filled with flowers, the old piano playing softly, his hands trembling as he slipped the ring on my finger. He'd whispered, "I promise you truth, always." I woke up before dawn with tears on my cheeks. I turned my head toward the empty chair beside the bed and whispered into the stillness, "Then why do I feel like I never really knew you at all?" The morning light had barely touched the curtains when I found myself standing before the study door again. The teacup in my hand had gone cold long ago, forgotten somewhere between my thoughts and my fears. For 10 years, I had avoided this room, not out of superstition, but respect. It was Thomas's space, his sanctuary. Even after he passed, I couldn't bring myself to disturb it. The smell of old books, the faint trace of tobacco on the curtains, the quiet order of his belongings, it all felt sacred, frozen in time. But that note, it wouldn't let me rest. I turned the knob slowly. It creaked, resisting for a moment, then gave way. The air inside felt untouched, as though it still belonged to him. Dust motes danced in the slanting sunlight. His desk sat by the window, exactly where he'd left it, papers neatly stacked, pen resting in its holder, a half-burned candle beside the lamp. I stepped closer, my heart thudding with something I couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or longing. His chair groaned softly as I pulled it out. I sat, running my hand along the polished wood of the desk. The surface was cool, but beneath it, I felt warmth. Memories. Years of his hands resting there, writing, sketching, praying. I opened the top drawer. Receipts, old letters, arrested keyring. Nothing unusual. The second drawer. Books, sermons, newspaper clippings. Then my eyes fell on the third, the one that wouldn't open. It had a small brass lock, old and stubborn. I remembered it vaguely from before. Thomas used to keep important papers there, he'd said. I never questioned it. I trusted him completely. Now that same lock felt like a challenge. I searched through the drawers again until I found a tiny key taped beneath the pencil holder. My breath caught. Had it always been there? Or had he hidden it knowing I'd one day come looking? With trembling fingers, I fit the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The drawer slid open, slow, hesitant, like an old wound revealing itself. Inside lay a single brown envelope. No dust, no wrinkles. Someone had placed it there with care. On the front, written in Thomas's neat, steady handwriting, were the words, Clara Johnson, 1952. I froze. 1952? That was 3 years before our wedding. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the name. I whispered it aloud, Clara Johnson, but it meant nothing to me. No family friend, no neighbor, no church acquaintance. Who was she? And why would her name still matter after all those years? I opened the envelope. Inside was a single black and white photograph. A young woman standing beside a willow tree, smiling shyly at the camera. Her hair was dark, her eyes bright, her dress simple but elegant. There was something familiar about the tenderness in her expression, something that reminded me of how Thomas used to look at me when we were first married. My heart twisted. Tucked behind the photograph was a small card with a date scribbled in faded ink. March 12, 1952. No message, no signature, just the date. I set the photograph on the desk and leaned back, staring at it as memories swirled in my mind. March 1952. That would have been the year Thomas finished seminary. He used to tell me how hard that year was, how he nearly gave up before something gave him strength again. Could Clara have been that something? I closed my eyes, and scenes from decades past replayed like flickering film reels. The day he first proposed to me under the oak tree near the church, the way his hands trembled as he asked, "Do you believe love can find us twice, Evelyn?" At the time, I thought it was a poetic thing to say. Now, it felt like a confession I'd missed. I held the photograph closer. The woman looked no younger than 20. Her smile was soft, uncertain. Behind her, the willow tree hung low, almost touching her shoulder. Something in the background caught my eye. A small stone chapel, half hidden by leaves. My breath caught again. I knew that chapel. It was in Milford, near the river, the same place where Thomas and I later married. My hands began to shake. Did he take her there first? I stood, clutching the edge of the desk for balance. 1,000 questions crowded my mind. Who was Clara? What happened to her? Did she die, leave? Was she the secret Thomas carried to his grave? The note I'd found yesterday. Forgive me for what I never said. echoed in my head like a ghostly whisper. Was he asking forgiveness for her? That evening, I sat by the fire, the photograph resting on my lap. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and the clock ticked endlessly, marking each passing second of my unraveling calm. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that whatever this was, it was long before me. But the heart doesn't measure time the way the mind does. The heart still bleeds for questions left unanswered. I wondered if Grace would know anything. Her mother, my daughter, Lillian, never heard me speak much about Thomas's early years. He rarely mentioned them himself. Still, a strange part of me wanted to protect his memory, to keep this secret between us, even as it burned in my chest. Love, after all, is strange. It doesn't stop you from being hurt. It just makes you want to understand why. Later that night, I returned to the study. I placed the envelope back in the drawer, but left the key on the desk. I couldn't bring myself to lock it again. As I turned off the lamp, the photograph seemed to glow faintly in the last flicker of light. Clara's eyes meeting mine across 70 years of silence. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that makes everything feel slower, more fragile. The rain hadn't come yet, but the air held that stillness before a storm. I sat at the breakfast table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea I couldn't bring myself to drink. Sleep had been impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the same words flickered in my mind like candlelight. If you ever find this, please forgive me. And now there was Clara Johnson. The name had settled somewhere deep in my thoughts, like dust you can't sweep away. I'd promised myself I wouldn't dig further, that I'd let the dead rest, that I'd honor the peace Thomas always cherished. But peace felt dishonest now. It was built on something hidden, something buried, and I needed to know what it was. The attic had always unsettled me. Even in my younger years, I'd rarely gone up there. Thomas used to keep it locked. Too cluttered, he'd say. Nothing up there worth tripping over. But that morning, I found myself standing at the bottom of the narrow staircase, the wooden ladder creaking under my hand. The light from the hallway barely reached the top, only illuminating a thin trail of dust drifting downward. I hesitated for a long time. Then I climbed. Each step groaned as if warning me to turn back. When I reached the top, the familiar scent of old wood, mothballs, and faint mildew wrapped around me. Dust floated through the air like fog. Piles of boxes were stacked against the rafters, relics of our shared life. Christmas decorations, old photographs, yellowing furniture covers. And in the farthest corner, half hidden beneath a sheet, sat an old wooden trunk I hadn't seen in decades. Thomas's trunk. I pulled off the sheet. Dust billowed into the air, making me cough. The brass hinges were tarnished, and the lock hung loosely open, almost inviting. Inside lay the past. Bundles of papers tied with ribbons, photographs, faded cards, and a few personal keepsakes, a silver watch, a torn map of Milford, and a stack of envelopes bound with string. I touched the top bundle. The paper felt thin, delicate, almost afraid of being handled. I untied the ribbon, revealing letters, all written in Thomas's neat, deliberate handwriting. The first few were dated in the early 1950s. Dear Clara. My breath caught. Each letter began the same way, Dear Clara, and ended with the same signature, Yours always, Thomas. I sat down on the floor, the trunk before me, the dust swirling like ghosts around my knees. The first letter spoke of hope. Dear Clara, the days have been long without your smile. The church feels emptier now that you've gone back home. I pray your illness is nothing serious. Every night I ask God to watch over you, and I promise I'll wait until you're well again. Yours always, Thomas. I blinked back tears. The paper had yellowed, but the emotion hadn't faded. His words still carried warmth, the tenderness of someone deeply, painfully in love. Letter after letter followed, months apart, sometimes weeks. Each spoke of faith, patience, and longing. He mentioned her frail health, her plans to return to Milford once she recovered. But somewhere along the line, his tone changed. The later letters grew restless, desperate even. I wrote to your mother again, but there's been no reply. The hospital says they cannot share information. Clara, if you can read this, please, just one word. Tell me you're alive. The ink bled slightly on that one, as though he'd written it in haste, or in tears. I flipped through them, my chest tightening with every page. Then I found one that wasn't sealed. It had never been sent. The envelope was addressed in fading ink. To my dearest Clara, wherever you may be. Inside, a single page, carefully folded. I opened it with trembling hands. My dearest Clara, if this letter ever finds you, I hope it brings you peace, though it may never reach your hands. I have prayed for years that you were still among the living, that perhaps fate would cross our paths again. But I fear now that you have gone where my prayers cannot reach. You were the light that led me to faith. When you fell ill, I told myself I would wait for you, that love could outlast time and distance. But time is cruel, Clara. It has changed me. It has given me a new life I never expected, a good and kind woman who has shown me grace beyond measure. Yet, even in the quiet of our home, there are nights when I still speak to you in prayer. Not because I love her less, but because I cannot erase the part of me that began with you. If God forgives me for loving twice, I pray you will too. Yours always, Thomas. I read it twice, then again. The silence in the attic grew unbearable. The wind outside picked up, rattling the shingles above me. I could almost hear his voice as I used to, calm, gentle, filled with conviction. He had loved her, deeply, honestly. And yet, somehow, he had found room in that same heart for me. For a long time, I sat there holding that letter, feeling as though I'd just read a piece of his soul, something he'd carried silently through our entire marriage. It wasn't betrayal, not exactly, but it was a secret, one he'd buried so carefully I might never have found it if not for that note in his Bible. As the thunder finally rolled outside, I gathered the letters and tied them back together with the ribbon. But I couldn't bring myself to put the unsent one away. I folded it gently, slipped it into my apron pocket, and carried it downstairs. When I reached the living room, I placed it beside the Bible on the table, two pieces of a truth I still couldn't fully understand. I whispered into the quiet, "Why didn't you tell me, Thomas?" But only the ticking clock replied. That night, the storm broke over the house. Rain lashed the windows, lightning flashed across the garden, and I sat awake, the letter still in my lap. Maybe, I thought, forgiveness isn't only for the living. Maybe it's something we keep learning to give, even when no one is left to ask for it. As thunder echoed through the halls, I closed my eyes and prayed for peace. Not for answers, but for peace. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the garden glistening in the soft sunlight. Puddles mirrored the gray sky, and the air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. I stood by the window for a long while, my hands resting on the sill, eyes unfocused. The letter from the attic still lay on the table beside Thomas's Bible. I hadn't moved it. I couldn't. All night I'd turned his words over in my mind, his prayers for Clara, his quiet sorrow, his plea for forgiveness. The pain in his writing didn't feel like guilt from deceit, it felt like mourning. But mourning what? Or whom? I needed to know what had really happened to Clara and what part of Thomas's heart I had truly known. So that morning, I put on my gray shawl, took my umbrella, and decided to visit the only man who might still remember the truth, Reverend Paul Whitmore. The church sat at the edge of Milford, near the river where the willows grew tall and solemn. It had changed little over the years. The stone walls were streaked with moss now, and the wooden doors bore new hinges, but the steeple still caught the morning light the same way it did the day Thomas and I said our vows. I could still remember standing there in my white dress, hands trembling, my heart pounding as Thomas looked at me with those calm eyes that promised forever. Back then, I never noticed the shadow behind his smile. When I entered the chapel, the scent of old wood and candle wax greeted me like an old hymn. A small group of parishioners were arranging flowers near the altar, but it was the voice from the back, warm and raspy with age, that caught my ear. "Mrs. Hale?" I turned. Reverend Paul looked older now, thinner, his hair nearly gone, but his eyes still carried that steady kindness that made people feel safe to confess their deepest fears. He smiled when he saw me. "It's been a long time. You haven't changed much." I returned a faint smile. "You always did have a generous way of lying, Reverend." He chuckled softly. "And you still have that spark. What brings you back to this old place?" I hesitated, unsure how to begin. "It's about Thomas." At the mention of his name, his smile faded into a gentler expression, the kind reserved for memory and loss. He was a good man, a heavy heart, but a good one. That phrase, "a heavy heart," made my stomach tighten. I stepped closer. "Reverend, I found something recently, a letter, a name I didn't recognize, Clara Johnson. I think she was someone he knew before me." He looked down, folding his hands. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed. "I was wondering when that name would come back to you." We sat together in one of the pews. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass window, painting the floor in fractured colors, blue, gold, crimson. He spoke slowly. Each word weighted. "Thomas came to me a few weeks before your wedding. I remember it clearly, because I'd never seen him that unsettled. He'd been working here at the church every day, helping with the children's classes, visiting the sick. But that morning, he walked into my study with tears in his eyes. I held my breath. He told me he couldn't marry you, that his heart was not free." My fingers tightened around the hem of my shawl. "He said there was someone, a woman he'd cared for deeply. She had fallen ill, and he'd promised to stay by her side. But her family took her away to another town, and not long after, word came that she'd passed." "Clara," I whispered. He nodded. "Yes, he carried that grief quietly, said he'd never forgiven himself for not going after her, for not keeping his promise." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and a single leaf drifted past the window like a sigh. I felt the weight of it then, the years of silence, the quiet prayers I'd never known he whispered at night. He wasn't haunted by guilt for betraying me. He was haunted by love unfinished, grief unresolved. Reverend Paul continued, his voice soft. "I told him that sometimes God allows us to love twice, once to teach us how to love, and once to teach us how to heal. I believe Clara was his first lesson, and you, Mrs. Hale, you were his second." Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. I pressed my hand to my mouth, nodding faintly. He placed a trembling hand over mine. "Thomas loved you, Evelyn, deeply, but he was a man who believed sorrow was a burden to carry alone. He never wanted his grief to become yours." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt sacred. Then I asked, "Did he ever speak of her again?" The Reverend shook his head. "Not once. After the wedding, he was a changed man. He devoted himself to his faith, to you, to your family. But sometimes," he looked toward the altar, "sometimes during prayer, I'd catch him with that faraway look, as though he were speaking to someone only he could see." I nodded slowly, remembering the quiet moments at home, how he'd sit by the window late at night, his lips moving silently in prayer. I used to think he was thanking God for the life we built. Now I wondered if he was also asking forgiveness from a soul long gone. When I left the church, the air was cool and crisp. The clouds had lifted, and the sunlight broke through the willows by the river, the same spot where, in that old photograph, Clara had once stood smiling. I walked there slowly, each step echoing with the rhythm of memory. Maybe he had brought her here, just as he had brought me years later. Maybe this place was his way of keeping both parts of his heart in one world, the lost and the found. I knelt by the edge of the water, touching the damp grass. "Thomas," I whispered, "you didn't fail her. You loved her. And somehow you still loved me too. That's enough." A single ray of sunlight broke through the branches, warm against my face. And for the first time since finding the note, I felt something lift. Not the pain, not completely, but the burden of misunderstanding. Love, I realized, doesn't always divide. Sometimes it simply lingers, reshaping itself quietly, tenderly, into something that survives even after loss. That night, I placed the Bible back on the shelf. The note was still tucked between the Psalms, exactly where I'd found it. But this time, when I looked at it, I didn't feel betrayed. I felt closer to him, as if, through sorrow, he'd finally let me into a part of his heart that had always been closed. And though he was gone, I whispered one last prayer into the quiet room. "I forgive you, my love, and I understand." The drive home was quiet. I kept the letter and the photograph tucked carefully in my bag, but it felt like I carried something far heavier, the weight of understanding, the ache of grief finally given a name. Rain had fallen again earlier in the day, leaving the streets glistening, the leaves on the maples shining like they had been polished. I watched the reflections ripple in the puddles, thinking about the strange journey I had taken with Thomas, a journey I hadn't even realized I was still on. By the time I reached our front door, my hands were clammy, and my heart ached in a way I hadn't felt in years. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of home enveloping me. Old wood, candle wax, and the faint aroma of Thomas's pipe lingering in the corners. It was comforting and painful all at once. I set the letter and photograph on the table beside his Bible, as if arranging a small altar to the memories I had just uncovered. I sat in his armchair, the one he had always favored, and let myself feel everything. Tears came, quietly at first, then in slow streams down my cheeks. For so long I had grieved only the man I knew, the man I had loved openly and completely. I hadn't allowed room in my heart for the man who had loved before, who had carried sorrow silently, who had hidden fragments of his soul even from me. Now I understood. I reached for the note I had found in the Bible days ago. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded it again. "If you ever find this, please forgive me. There's something I never told you." I read the words slowly, letting each one sink in. Thomas had trusted me enough to leave this note, knowing I would one day understand. Not because he doubted my love, but because he feared his past might shadow our life together. I thought about Clara Johnson, about the love that had come before me, fleeting and tragic, about the grief that had lingered in my husband's heart, shaping him, teaching him, and quietly preparing him to love again. It wasn't betrayal. It was history. It was pain. It was a piece of the man I had always adored, and now I saw it in full. I opened my journal, the leather cover soft beneath my fingers, and picked up a pen. I wrote slowly, the words flowing in a way I hadn't written in years. Love is never perfect. It doesn't ask for fairness or for understanding at first glance. It asks for patience, for compassion, and for the courage to forgive even what we do not yet fully know. Thomas carried a sorrow I could not have imagined. Yet, in that sorrow, he loved me. He loved me fiercely, wholly, even while mourning what he had lost. How could I not forgive him? How could I not see that love is not measured by perfection, but by the heart's capacity to endure and give again? I paused, setting the pen down. My eyes fell again on the photograph of Clara. The woman's smile seemed almost to fade in the dim light of the living room, as if yielding space to the life that had followed, my life with Thomas. I touched the edges of the photograph, my fingers brushing against the memory, the grief, the love that had been silent for so long. Forgiveness is not forgetting, I wrote. It is not excusing or erasing. It is understanding that the people we love are made of many layers, some bright, some shadowed. And if we can see all of them, love becomes stronger, truer. I set the pen down finally and leaned back in the chair. The room felt different, lighter somehow, even though the storm outside had returned, battering the windows with rain and wind. I felt tears still clinging to my lashes, but peace too. Quiet, deep, resilient. I imagined Thomas beside me, smiling gently, as if he could finally rest knowing that I understood. Not only the note, not only Clara, but the man he had been before me and the man he had become with me. Love had been imperfect, yes, but it had been steadfast, tender, enduring. And now, at last, forgiveness had found its place between the lines of all those letters, all those memories, and all those years of quiet life together. I closed my journal softly and looked around the room. My home, my life, my heart, everything felt intact, as if the past had been acknowledged and released. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled. It was late afternoon when Grace returned. The sun had softened into a golden glow, painting the living room with warmth. I had been sitting by the window, leafing through Thomas's old letters again, when I heard the familiar creak of the front door. "Grandma?" "Grace, dear, I'm right here." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I closed the letter and set it on the table, hoping she wouldn't notice the note still tucked into the Bible beside it. She stepped inside, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the garden. Her eyes, sharp and curious as ever, scanned the room. "You've been busy today, haven't you?" "Yes, just tidying up," I said, smoothing my hands over my skirt. Grace wandered over to the bookshelf where Thomas's Bible rested, almost unconsciously flipping it open. And then, without any warning, her eyes widened. She froze. "Grandma," she whispered. I followed her gaze. My heart skipped a beat. There, folded between the pages of the Psalms, was the note I had tucked in for safekeeping. I found this," she said, holding it delicately as though it might break in her hands. I swallowed hard. I could have taken it from her, hidden it again, preserved the mystery a little longer. But something in her eyes, that mixture of curiosity and concern, made me stop. "No, Grace," I said softly. "You should see it." She sat beside me, careful to keep a respectful distance. "Grandma, I don't understand. Did he mean something bad?" I shook my head, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "No, sweetheart, it's not bad. It's complicated and beautiful in a way you might not understand yet." I took the note from her hands and unfolded it, reading aloud slowly. "If you ever find this, please forgive me. There's something I never told you. Her hand reached out to cover mine. Who was he talking about? I drew a deep breath, the memories spilling over me like a tide. There was someone before me. Her name was Clara Johnson. She was very dear to him, Grace, but she fell ill and left him long before he ever met me. He carried that sorrow quietly for decades, even as we built our life together. Grace's eyes grew wide, but she didn't speak. She listened. And in her silence, I felt a bridge form between us, a bridge made of stories, love, and the quiet endurance of the human heart. I found letters, too, I continued. Letters he wrote to her, prayers he whispered for her health. There was a day I discovered one he never sent, a final letter to her, telling her that even if she was gone, he hoped she understood he had loved her, and then he loved me too. Tears filled my eyes again, but Grace's hand squeezed mine gently. Grandma, he loved so deeply, even before he met you. Yes, I said, and he loved me. That's what I've come to understand. Love doesn't disappear. It doesn't divide. Sometimes it endures in layers, past and present, sorrow and joy, loss and gain. Grace leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a moment we sat together in the soft light, 2 generations connected not just by blood, but by the lessons of a life well loved. I never knew love could be so patient, she whispered. Love is patient, Grace, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. It waits, it forgives, and sometimes it teaches us how to carry loss without letting it break us. She pulled back slightly, her young eyes bright with understanding. I think I understand now, Grandma. I think I understand him and you. A gentle peace settled over me. After years of holding secrets, of carrying grief and love in quiet balance, I finally felt the weight ease. Not entirely gone, grief never fully disappears, but reshaped, softened, woven into memory and story, into something that could now be shared. We stayed there for a long time, talking softly about Thomas, about Clara, about the nature of love and forgiveness. And in those quiet hours, I realized something profound. By sharing this truth with Grace, I was not only healing my own heart, I was giving her a gift too. A lesson in endurance, in compassion, and in the strength of the human spirit to hold love in all its imperfect, tender forms. When she finally left, promising to come back soon, I returned to the window. The sunlight had shifted, painting the room in warmer tones. I held Thomas's Bible in my hands, the note tucked safely inside, and whispered a quiet prayer. Thank you, my love, for trusting me with your heart and for letting me finally see yours fully. For the first time in a long while, the house felt whole. The house was quiet that morning, bathed in soft golden light that streamed through the lace curtains. The warmth touched the edges of the room, illuminating the familiar corners of our home. The bookshelves lined with worn novels, the clock ticking steadily on the mantel, the armchair where Thomas had spent so many afternoons reading quietly. I sat at the table, Thomas's Bible open before me. The note I had discovered long ago rested gently between the Psalms. I had reread it countless times since discovering Clara and learning the truth. Each reading brought me deeper into understanding, deeper into him, and somehow deeper into myself. I reached for my journal, now filled with reflections on love, forgiveness, and the life Thomas and I had shared. I had written pages, explored memories, and spoken aloud to him countless times in my mind. But now I felt the need to leave something tangible, something he could find, wherever his spirit might rest. I took a piece of paper and a pen. My hand trembled slightly, but my heart was steady. I wrote slowly, deliberately, thinking of the man I had loved for so many years. I found your secret, Thomas, and I forgive you. I always did. I folded the note carefully as he had folded his own, and placed it gently beside his in the Bible. I brushed my fingers over the words, imagining him reading it, feeling the weight of my forgiveness and understanding. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the Bible. The sunlight shifted, warming my shoulders, as though the room itself was acknowledging the release of years of silent sorrow. I closed the Bible softly, feeling the smooth cover under my fingers. I whispered into the quiet room, my voice tender, reverent, and full of the love that had sustained me all these years. Now you can rest, my love, and so can I. A gentle breeze drifted through the open window, ruffling the pages of the Bible and carrying with it the faint scent of lilacs from the garden. I imagined it as Thomas's sigh of relief, a soft acknowledgement that the burden he had carried for decades had finally been shared, understood, and forgiven. For the first time in a long while, the house felt completely at peace. Not empty, not silent, but whole. Thomas's presence lingered in the light, in the quiet corners, and most of all, in the warmth that settled in my heart. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes. A sense of calm washed over me, tender and steady, like a gentle hand on my shoulder. The years of grief, the unanswered questions, the hidden sorrow, they were no longer chains around my heart. They were threads woven into a tapestry of love that endured, even beyond life. And in that moment, I felt it clearly. Love is never lost. It lingers, quietly, faithfully, forgiving and forgiving again. I placed the Bible back on the shelf, exactly where it had rested for so many years. The two notes lay nestled together now, a conversation spanning decades between a man who carried his sorrow in silence and a woman who chose to understand it fully. I rose from the chair, feeling lighter than I had in years. Stepping to the window, I watched the sun climb higher, the garden glowing, the world moving gently forward. I whispered one last time, "We did it, Thomas. We found peace. Together." And for the first time in a long while, I smiled without the ache of the past pressing against me. I placed the Bible back on the shelf, exactly where it had rested for so many years. The two notes lay nestled together now, a conversation spanning decades between a man who carried his sorrow in silence and a woman who chose to understand it fully. I rose from the chair, feeling lighter than I had in years. Stepping to the window, I watched the sun climb higher, the garden glowing, the world moving gently forward. I whispered one last time, "We did it, Thomas. We found peace. Together." And for the first time in a long while, I smiled without the ache of the past pressing against me. Winter came softly that year, laying a thin blanket of frost across the garden and dusting the branches of the willows with silver. The mornings were quiet, the sunlight muted and pale, and the house felt still in a way that made time itself seem slower. Evelyn moved through her days with calm deliberation. The aches of age had begun to settle into her bones, and her steps were slower, but her mind remained sharp. The letters to Grace, which she had begun writing in the warmth of autumn, had grown into small volumes of advice, memories, and love. Each page carried a piece of her heart, lessons about life, about love, and about forgiveness. She spent hours by the window, wrapped in her shawl, watching the frost glisten on the garden and recalling the years of her life with Thomas. His laughter, the quiet comfort of his presence, the way he had loved her despite the secret sorrow he carried, all of it lingered in the corners of her mind like a gentle light. Her Bible was never far from her side. Each morning she opened it and read from the Psalms and the Proverbs, tracing her fingers over the notes she and Thomas had left for one another. Often she would pause at the folded paper she had written years ago. "I found your secret, Thomas, and I forgive you. I always did." Sometimes she imagined him smiling, standing beside her in the quiet light of the room. It comforted her to believe that he was near, that the years of their love, sorrow, and understanding had not ended. They had only shifted into another form, delicate and enduring. Grace came by frequently, bringing warmth, chatter, and life into the old house. But Evelyn often told her to leave the letters unopened until she felt ready. Instead, they sat together by the fire, talking about small things, the garden, the snow, family stories, and sometimes about Thomas. "Grandma," Grace said one afternoon, brushing the snow from her coat, "do you miss him?" Evelyn smiled softly, looking out at the white blanketed garden. "I do, my dear, but it's not the kind of missing that aches anymore. It's gentle now, like a soft memory that lives with me every day." Grace nodded, her young eyes understanding something older than words. She rested her head against Evelyn's shoulder, feeling the warmth of love that had lasted decades. As the days grew colder and the nights longer, Evelyn found herself reflecting more on the life she had shared, the mistakes forgiven, and the secrets uncovered. The house was still, save for the ticking clock and the crackling fire. She wrote one final note in her journal. "I have lived well. I have loved deeply. I have forgiven and been forgiven. And in all of it, I have found peace." Sometimes she read aloud to herself, her voice soft and steady, as if speaking directly to Thomas. "I am here, my love, and I am ready for whatever comes next." Even in the quiet, there was no fear. There was only a calm acceptance, a gentle sorrow that did not weigh, and a profound sense of connection to her past, to her love, and to the generations who would carry her stories forward. On one particularly still morning, Evelyn sat by the window with her Bible in her lap. The frost sparkled on the garden, the wind whispered through the trees, and a soft sunlight broke through the clouds. She traced the edges of the folded notes, her fingers lingering on the words she had written years ago. "I am with you, Thomas," she whispered, a smile touching her lips. "Always." And in that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by memories, love, and forgiveness, Evelyn felt closer to him than ever, a presence that was no longer bound by life or time, but by the enduring heart that had loved, lost, and finally peace. The winter outside was still, the house was warm, and inside Evelyn's heart, the long journey of love and understanding had reached its gentle conclusion. The house was unusually quiet that morning. Evelyn's chair sat empty by the window, her shawl folded neatly on the armrest, and the faint scent of lilacs lingered in the air, a reminder of the life that had once filled every corner with warmth. Grace walked through the living room slowly, her fingers brushing over the mantel, the old clock, and finally resting on Thomas's Bible, still sitting where Evelyn had left it. Something compelled her to open it. Her eyes widened as she found the notes tucked carefully between the Psalms. Thomas's note from decades ago, and Evelyn's gentle reply. She picked them up, reading them slowly, letting the words sink into her heart. "If you ever find this, please forgive me. There's something I never told you. I found your secret, Thomas, and I forgive you. I always did." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of understanding, of connection, and of profound respect for the life her grandmother had lived. She could feel the weight of years, the depth of love, and the patience that had carried Evelyn through both grief and joy. Sitting by the window, Grace thought of her grandmother's stories, the lessons woven between letters, Bible readings, and quiet reflections. She realized that love was never perfect, but it was enduring. That forgiveness could transform sorrow into peace. That faith could bridge even the deepest silences between hearts. Gently, Grace placed the Bible on her own bedside table. Sunlight spilled over its cover, falling just as it had in Evelyn's home, warm and golden. She touched the notes once more, whispering softly, Thank you, Grandma. Thank you, Thomas. Your love has taught me everything I need to carry forward. And in that quiet room, bathed in sunlight, Grace felt the enduring presence of both her grandmother and her grandfather, a legacy of love, forgiveness, and faith that would remain with her forever.